Hi, I'm Renee and I'm an astrologer. And today I want to do a video about how to read a birth chart. I've Googled and seen some videos that have a similar title, but most of them seem to get a little bit too far into how to interpret a birth chart. And I think when you're first learning, the chart can be so intimidating that it's really helpful to have somebody break it down and tell you exactly what you're looking at. So that's what I'm going to do today. So let's get started. So astrology is a really fun tool to add to your self-discovery toolkit, but astrological charts can be complicated and intimidating if you don't know how to read them. Today, I'm going to give you a simple as possible and non-technical as possible explanation of what you're looking at when you see a birth chart and how to decode what it means. I just picked a random chart for this exercise, and I went with one of my OG crushes, Trent Reznor, because I'm still a little 90s goth at heart. Now, first of all, don't panic. I'm sure when you look at this, it's like, what the fuck is all that? This is far too complicated. I give up. I promise you can do this. And once you get the hang of it, it really does become like being able to read a different language. I will sit and just stare at a birth chart and read it for a while. It's just a matter of learning what the symbols mean. Like when you're a kid and you come up with a secret code. If you never did that, you might not be neurospicy, but that's okay because it won't impact your ability to understand an astrological chart. So the first thing we're going to tackle is the big circle. The big circle is an imaginary field around the Earth. And you can think of yourself as standing in the middle of the circle like Trent here. The circle is divided into 12 different zones called houses that tell us about the areas of life where activity is concentrated in this lifetime. I like to use a theater metaphor when I'm explaining astrology, and in that metaphor, the houses are like the stage that the play is happening on. Each house has a different vibe, and the stage for each house will be set up differently. But what's important to remember is the houses are telling us where in life energy and activity is concentrated. Astrology charts always start at the middle left with the first house. This is also how you figure out what your ascendant sign is. The ascendant refers to the sign that was on the eastern horizon when you were born. You can imagine the sun breaking its light over the horizon before ascending into the sky from our perspective as an image to remind you of that placement. The ascendant is always in the first house and often is the start of the first house. Either way, that middle left spot is where you're going to start counting from. We're going to look at this scary thing again, but instead of seeing all the mishmash that's happening, just focus on that middle left spot, and I want you to notice the brown arrow inside the chart wheel. That's how you can find that first house. And typically you just count from there. Once you get more familiar with charts, you won't need to count anymore. You'll just recognize by sight which house is which. But until then, count away. Now, charts can look different. Some will have house numbers and others won't, but that middle left zone will always be where you look to find the first house. And just to keep things extra confusing, there are some charts where the ascendant and the start of the first house don't line up exactly. This is because there's different mathematical formulas for calculating the houses, and we'll leave it at that for now. In those kinds of charts, there will be a separate notation indicating the ascendant, and usually a thicker line denoting the first house. But the first house will always be in that middle left area. As I mentioned, I like to use a theater metaphor to explain the different elements of the chart. If you think of life as a play, in astrology, the houses represent the stage. The stage of each house is set up in a way that corresponds to that area of life. In the first house, we're learning about us, the individual. So that stage is set up to be all about me. We can think of the houses as a journey further and further away from the individual. In the first house, it's me. In the second house, it's my stuff. This includes my finances, my values, and my resources. But just think of it as my stuff for now. In the third house, we're on the communication stage. Siblings also go in this house, and short journeys and neighbors. Essentially, the first people and places we encounter in life and start talking to and sharing information with and learning from. The fourth house is the stage set up as a representation of our home, family, and ancestral legacy. The fifth house is about creative expression and how we externalize what's inside of us. The sixth house is the stage where we find all the little rituals we do day to day to serve ourselves and others and refine what's come before to prepare us to go out and encounter the wider world. The chart can be separated lots of ways, and one of those is bottom half and top half, where the bottom half is about our interior experience and the top half is about our experiences out in the world. In the seventh house, we encounter the other, which is the natural opposite of the individual. This is where we find our important one-on-one relationships, including spouses, very best friends, and business partners. After we've paired up with someone, we are confronted with the experience of intimacy, which we find in the eighth house. This house is where we are merging emotionally and logistically, joining our lives with someone else. And as the opposite of the second house, it has to do with our stuff. In the ninth house, we're making meaning of everything we've encountered so far and expanding our minds. If the third house is information, the ninth house opposite is making meaning of that information. In the 10th house, we're on the world stage learning about what we feel called to contribute in this lifetime. This may or may not correspond to our career, but always includes what we want to be known for. This is the out in the world house, opposite our fourth house of in the home. The 11th house tells us about our experiences in groups and as part of the collective. Where the fifth house is all about our individual contribution, the 11th house is what we bring to the group and how we experience groups. And the 12th house is where we're invited to surrender and transcend the earthly experience. The sixth house is very much about our day-to-day material existence, and the 12th is mysterious and otherworldly. So again, the houses are the areas of life where things are happening, or the stage and setting of the play. Back to the scary circle. To simplify what you're seeing, ignore all the lines in the center circle and all the symbols in the, well, everywhere, but especially the exterior of the circle, and just focus on the middle circle. In fact, let's simplify this. These are the houses. As you can see, some of them are empty and some have tenants. And now we're going to learn about these tenants in the houses. Continuing our theater metaphor, if the houses are the stage, the planets are the characters. Each planet represents a different part of us. In the chart, planets and signs are represented by symbols called glyphs. When you're looking at a birth chart, the tenants in the houses are the planets with some additional information to tell you about where the planet is in space and what sign it's hanging out in. For everything listed in the chart, you'll see the glyph of the planet first, followed by the degree the planet is at, then a glyph representing the sign the planet is in, and ending with the number of minutes into the degree that planet is at. With the numbers, it's kind of like a clock time. Every sign gets 30 degrees of the zodiac, and each degree equals 60 minutes of time. It's like saying 12:42 p.m. instead of just saying 12 p.m. It's more specific, but can feel a little busy and confusing to new astro eyes. The first thing to get used to is spotting the planets, which are always situated the furthest out in the line of information. If you look at the chart here and focus on the symbols at the outermost edge, those will tell you which planet is where. Some planets, like the moon, have symbols that are easy to recognize because they look like what they are. You might also recognize the symbol for Mars, which is often used to represent masculine energy or men, and the symbol for Venus, which is used to represent feminine energy or women. If you want to practice, pause here and take a minute to try and find the other symbols in the chart. Where's Saturn? Where's Neptune? Where's Jupiter? The more you practice, the quicker you'll get at recognizing each of these symbols, but there are some ways to help us remember them more easily. So the sun glyph is a circle, like the sun, so it's pretty easy to recognize. Same with the moon, it's a crescent moon. So hopefully that's also equally easy to commit to memory. Mercury's glyph represents the winged helmet of the god. You might imagine it as a person with a huge circular head and a tiny crossbody and little wings on its helmet. Venus is a familiar symbol to many of us, but you can also think of it as a hand mirror because Venus is the archetype of beauty and the goddess probably spent at least some time staring at the mirror, pondering her gorgeous face. Mars is our inner warrior. And again, you might already know this symbol as a symbol for the masculine, but you can also remember it as the shield and spear of the warrior. Now is where we get a little weird. Jupiter is the Roman name for Zeus, so those gods are one and the same. And the glyph for Jupiter can resemble a Z with a line through it for Zeus, or perhaps a lightning bolt, or you can remember it the way I do, as looking like a number 4. Saturn is a god of agriculture and time, and its glyph looks like a scythe, which is a tool used to cut plants and a symbol of how Father Time comes along and cuts our lives off at the end. Morbid but true. Neptune is the god of the sea, and its glyph is based on the god's trident, which I think makes it relatively easy to remember. Uranus is another one I struggled to learn because it doesn't really remind me of anything. Apparently, it's the cross of matter over the circle of spirit with 2 semicircles to represent receptivity. I love Uranus because it's the weirdo of the planets. It orbits on its side, and it represents the principles of revolution and rebellion. I kind of learned to recognize Uranus by thinking of it as the weirdest glyph, i.e. the one that didn't really have a story that made it stick in my mind, which is pretty Uranian of it. Also, fun fact, Uranus was almost named Herschel after the dude who discovered it, and I think it's fun to imagine that because it's kind of like naming a dog Carol or Helen. Pluto has 2 glyphs that are relatively common. Uranus also has 2, but we mostly see the one I've included here, so I left the other one out for simplicity's sake. One of Pluto's glyphs is super easy to remember because it's basically a P for Pluto. The other, which is the one I more commonly come across, took me a bit longer to commit to memory. Again, we have a cross of matter, a circle of spirit, and a semicircle of receptivity, which doesn't really help me commit this to memory. Honestly, I think I learned this one by process of elimination. You can also think of it as representing Hades' 2-pronged trident, but that will probably only help if you're familiar with the god. So if you have suggestions for how to memorize this one, let me know in the comments because I'm still looking for a good one. The planets represent different parts of our personality and different principles in our lives. I don't want to spend too much time on that because this video is about how to read the chart, not how to interpret it. But here are the planets and a quick summary of what they represent, and you can pause and read through it if you want. If we go back to Trent's chart, we can map the planets out in the houses like this. The sun is in the 4th house, Jupiter and Venus are in the 5th, Uranus, Mars, and Pluto are in the 8th, Neptune's in the 10th, the moon is in the 12th, and Saturn is in the 2nd. So when you're interpreting a chart, you're thinking about what it might be like for that character, the planet, to exist in that environment, the house. But to truly get the whole picture and decode the chart, we have to add one more layer, the astrological signs. Continuing our theater metaphor, if the houses are the stage and the planets are the characters, the signs are the costumes the characters are wearing in this lifetime. They tell us about the style of expression for that part of ourselves. Just like the planets, the signs all have glyphs to represent them in a chart, and the glyphs have reasons for looking the way they do that can help us get familiar with them. Aries resembles the horns of a ram, which is the animal that represents the sign. Taurus is the horns of the bull, which is the animal that represents Taurus. Gemini is a 2, which represents the twins that the sign is named after. Cancer is the claws of a crab, which is the animal that represents Cancer. Leo is the mane of a lion, which is the animal that represents the sign. Virgo is the first glyph that confused me a little bit. It looks like an M with a closed loop on the end, which is sort of similar to Scorpio's M with an arrow on the end. Virgo is represented by our first human character, the Virgin, which doesn't have to do with sexual abstinence, but is instead about fully belonging solely to oneself. So we can think of Virgo's closed loop as representing how the sign is closed off to external influences and belongs only to itself. Libra is our only inanimate object in the zodiac and is represented by the scales of justice, which refers to Libra's need to consider the other, whether that's another person or another point of view. Libra is always weighing both sides and sometimes struggling to decide between them, and that makes this glyph pretty easy to commit to memory. With Scorpio, we're back to animals. This one is represented by the scorpion, and we can remember the glyph by connecting the pointy arrow at the end of the M with the scorpion's stinger. Sagittarius is a super easy one for me to remember because Sagittarius is represented by the centaur, who's also an archer, and the glyph is an arrow. Then there's Capricorn, which is not as easy to remember, at least when you're learning to draw it, but the sign is represented by the sea goat, and so the glyph represents the goat's horns and the fish tail. The glyph for Aquarius is two lines representing water because Aquarius is associated with the mythical figure Ganymede, who is the cupbearer to the gods. The water is the water of knowledge, and Aquarius is the energetic of pouring the water of knowledge onto all of humanity. Fun fact, in the myth, Zeus, who's totally queer, falls in love with Ganymede because he's such a babe and turns into an eagle to abduct Ganymede and bring him to Olympus, where he becomes immortal and spends his time hanging by Zeus's side, pouring water for the gods, in a win for the gay agenda. Last but not least is Pisces, which is represented by two fish swimming in opposite directions while tied together, which if you are or know a Pisces, you probably get why. So now that we understand what the symbols represent, we can finally read the chart. If we return to Trent's simplified chart, we can see that there's the planet glyph at the furthest edge of the circle, the degree of the sign, and then the glyph for the sign followed by the minute of the sign. So we have Moon in Sagittarius in the 12th, Neptune in the 10th in Scorpio, Pluto, Mars, and Uranus in the 8th in Virgo, Venus and Jupiter in the 5th in Gemini, Sun in Taurus in the 4th, and Saturn and Pisces in the 2nd. When you're just starting out, you can really ignore the numbers and just focus on the planet and sign information, i.e. Moon in Sagittarius or Mercury in Taurus. If we take away one layer of simplicity, you'll see that the signs are actually included in the rainbow ring around the edge of the circle to make it easier to see which sign overlaps with which house. In this and many house systems, the signs and houses don't line up exactly, which is part of what can make it confusing to understand. But hopefully it's making a little more sense to your eyes now. Essentially, you don't need to worry about that information yet. You can just focus on the middle area of the chart. The other thing we have in this chart is degree information for the house cusps. Cusp just means border, and it's important to know which sign is on each cusp when you get deeper into astrological analysis. But for now, all I want you to take away is that this is just more information about the way the signs are organized in the chart. And if you're not working with house cusps yet, you don't really need to pay attention to these notations. Again, what matters is that middle ring. Okay, let's look at the chart in all its complicated glory. In the center of the chart are a bunch of confusing colored lines. So what the heck are those? These lines represent aspects between the planets. If we go back to the theater metaphor, you can think of these like the dialogue that's happening between the characters on the stage. Aspects are another more complicated part of astrology that you don't need to worry about when you're just starting to read a chart, though it can be interesting to just look at them and take in the vibes they give you. One of my favorite charts for this belongs to Janelle Monáe because I feel like if you're familiar with Janelle and you look at her chart, even without knowing anything about astrology at all, you can see her vibe reflected in that chart shape. Here's Janelle's chart in case you're curious. I mean, do you even need to know anything about astrology to get that the two images are showing us a similar thing? I don't think so. When you're learning to read a chart, my advice is ignore the aspects the same way you're going to ignore the info on the outermost ring of the chart. The essential info is here: the planets, the signs, and the houses. So once you know what the glyphs are, you'll be able to spot which planet is in which sign and which house. And when you know that, you can start researching the meanings associated with those placements. Now, a warning. If you are trying to interpret chart information on your own, there are some best practices to follow. 1, remember that anything written about a placement has to be as general as possible in order to reflect the greatest possible number of expressions. So if you look up Moon in Sagittarius, you'll get a description that is trying to apply to all the moons in Sagittarius. But as we've learned, our planets are in a complicated play, wearing costumes on stages and having dialogue with each other. When you can look at the whole chart, you can get super specific. But when you're reading a general description of just one placement, that specificity goes out the window. So you've got to take what resonates and chuck out the rest. There's nothing wrong with you if you Google one of your placements and you don't resonate with every bit of what you read. You're not supposed to. And the description is really a jumping off point for your own imagination to interpret the placement in the context of the rest of the chart. 2, look for an author's name. If you find some random article online that has no listed author, give it some side eye. You need to know who's giving you this astrological knowledge if you're going to trust it. Books are your best resource in this case, and I will include a link to Astrology University's Year 1 reading list in the description of this video. That's a great place to start from if you're trying to figure out who's a legit source of info in the astrological world. Finally, it's natural as a human to wish there was some sort of rule book for how to be that would make life easier to live. There's not. It's very common when you start exploring astrology to have the experience of feeling seen and then want to use astrology as a sort of manual for moving through the world. But nothing in life can save us from having to make our own choices and own the consequences of those choices. Astrology is a tool to help us know and understand ourselves better, not a prescriptive rule book. As much as astrologers have figured out about astrology so far, there is endless mystery to the universe, and anything or anyone who tries to tell you how to live as if they know better than you is suspicious. Astrology is a map to deeper self-understanding and acceptance, but it can't give you concrete answers to the hard questions in life. Sorry. If you get stuck or confused, reach out to an astrologer like me for help. As a reminder, you can find me at astrologybyrenee.com or on socials at astrologybyrenee, and I offer sliding scale pricing so anyone who wants access to astrology can get it. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please do all the gross internet support moves and like it, add a comment or a question if you have any, and share prolifically so I can find more people who might resonate with my point of view and benefit from the work I do. That's all for today. Goodbye.